Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Myth Vision Podcast. We're going to discuss Matthew's mythical birth narrative of Jesus. That's right, we're not going to play games. We're going to let you know what's going on in this text. And I have Dr. Aaron Adair joining us today. Dr. Adair, welcome back.
Thank you for having me again.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate what you do. You wrote a great book here, The Star of Bethlehem, A Skeptical View, and I imagine some overlap in our discussion today will take place pertaining to the literature. You've done a deep dive. It's not a heavy read. It's simple. So go and subscribe to his YouTube channel. It is in the description. Help support the scholars. He is a scientist, and I'll ask you, if you don't mind, to cover your background briefly. But the book is on Amazon as well. The Star of Bethlehem, A Skeptical View. You are a scientist, going back to your website. That is also in the description. Tell us a little bit about your expertise, and we'll continue.
Yeah. So, my primary area of research and studies has been in physics. Did my PhD at The Ohio State University. And also have done quite a fair bit of biblical studies. I'm also kind of glad that you started the presentation that you did with the unrolling of the Revelation scroll, because recently I did a presentation at SBL about one part of Revelation. I didn't unravel any doomsday scrolls for better or for worse. But let's just say this much. It was also a bit interesting to go to the conference, and because I'm a research affiliate at MIT, I had MIT on my name tag there, and people were looking at it like, they have a New Testament studies department there. I end up confusing quite a few folks.
Wow. Yeah. And I know that presentation. I'm looking forward to hearing the results. Me and you haven't even caught up. You told me you bumped into some great scholars like Daniel McClellan and, of course, Paula Fredrickson while you were there. And you tickled my ears. What did you say again?
So a couple of fun things. Like literally in my hotel the morning that I got there, opened up the elevator and Dennis McDonald was in there, and I'm like, "Hey, it's Mr. McDonald. It's Dr. McDonald. I'm gonna chat with you." We got breakfast together. Hit it off pretty well while we were together. And I had known Dan McClellan from over a decade earlier. That we had been digital friends for a while. First time we got to meet in Meet Space. And in particular, at one of the presentations that Daniel was running, Paula Frederick was there, and they were chatting a little bit before there, and they were talking about you, and you were
Wow.
a good host.
Well, thank you. And I'm glad to hear that. That's what tickled my ears. I was like, all right, I'm doing something right. Even Paula was like, this was different because she's never done anything like the interviews that I did and the questions I brought and stuff. But she said she enjoyed it. And that's what really mattered to me, was like, okay, this is cool. I got to give her a new experience, because the only interviews she's ever done like that were either conferences where she lectures or on TV where she's on the news. And I was honored to be able to be the first to ever do that from YouTube and bring that to the public. And of course, I still have a ton of videos that I've done with her that are on the Patreon that I haven't made public yet. And so I hope that people help support us and go from there. I know today you have a presentation. Before we get into that, I want to say, so that course that I was talking about, Other Virgin Births with Bart Ehrman, they just did the live last night. It was really, really well done. I have questions, but then again, that's because I read other scholars, right? And I'm like learning from the different people. And I'm curious to investigate Jesus Deus again in getting Dr. Litwa, because he says some things in there that I think go a little further, but the information was gold that Bart brought in. And it's so analogous to other heroes, figures, demigods, philosophers, gods, you name it, being born, as we would say, from the union of a god and a mortal. And sometimes it sounds almost mystique and miraculous, where we're like, come on, dude, a snake? Like different things that happen.
Yeah.
And so you're like, is this a Xerox copy? I don't think it needs to be. But we're going to get into Matthew today, as we titled this, and I'm suspecting akin the book. So would you like to start off kind of giving us an appetizer before starting the presentation, or?
Absolutely, yeah. So this time of year, it's supposed to be the war on Christmas, but I decided to be a little bit more friendly towards the narrative rather than just doing the standard debunk and here's all the ways that we know that Jesus wasn't born of a virgin or all those things. It's like I wanted to try to show you could say charity, but actually more understanding this narrative better and seeing that it's not just like a hodgepodge of the fever dream of someone who's just trying to, promote religion. This is someone who is actually showing their theological and literary skills by putting this together. And when you see it like that, then all the attempts to try to find where's the historicity in these birth stories or look for actual astronomical alignments starts to look silly once you understand the beauty of what's actually going on rather than the square peg that we try to force that round hole into.
I love that. So we need to re-examine the genre.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we do that, and I'm throwing this out there as like an advanced little, my prediction, the atheist won't be so antagonistic to the narrative because they'll understand what it is and not feel the tension from fundamentalists who want to shove this down your throat, literally. I would say in this case, maybe a case could be made. Don't blame the text, blame the people who can't grasp this genre, or at least try to help them. Don't blame them, but maybe try to help them see this genre. And that's what we're trying to do today, I think, rather than the blame game. And as Dennis McDonald says, we don't want people hating the text. Can't help that at some point. Some people have been traumatized by people who yield it as a weapon. But coming to find out, these are really smart people that have like created these narratives. And that's the angle I'd like to approach it.
Yeah, and I think that's the healthy way to approach it. In the same way, if we're going to approach the myths of Homer, we're going to look at the history of the text reception, how the things were created, the good, the bad, the ugly, have the full package rather than coming in either in defense or an attack. But let's, as much as possible, take in as much of the whole picture and see what might be hiding under there that we may have also missed in previous analysis.
And just because you're a scientist, I want to bring up, you're in what, Sputnik 55 right now? See in the background there, it looks like you're...
This is the internals of the TARDIS from Doctor Who circa 1983, more or less. So, yes, with this device, in theory, I can go into any time and space in the whole universe. So just have to run the central console, let it grind away, and then I can appear anywhere and any when. If the time circuit is working properly.
Well, I imagine you know what you're doing, and so let's take that space shuttle teleportation back in time to Matthew's narrative and see what's going on in the text. And with that being said, let's get your presentation going.
Very good, very good. All right. So, should be embiggen now. So, I want to note that this presentation is going to only be focused on Matthew's version of the story. I really won't be talking about Luke's version, which of course has very noticeable differences, and I definitely won't get into the modern iterations of the nativity plays, which is trying to amalgamate the canonical versions and some of the non-canonical stories that get into there. I just want to be focused on one particular version, one artistic vision for the birth of Jesus, and to see how this might have actually been put together and understand more fully what was the purpose and the skill set of this author.
Just so you know, it hasn't taken up the full screen, and we do still know. So I don't know if...
I think I know how I can make the adjustment. So let me stop sharing and share my screen proper.
I know that you want it done right, so I know. Okay.
All right. So right now there's probably screens within screens.
I'll wait for you to start. Okay, there you go.
Okay. How does that look?
Yep, there it is. Full screen. Cool.
Very good. Okay. All right. Now I know that there's different sharings within there, sharing window versus sharing the whole screen. So here we are. So we know this scene. Let's see how it might have come about. Now, very obviously, the birth of Jesus is described as real special. Jesus is quite the mensch. That's supposed to be the basic point of these sorts of stories. And it falls into things that are very trope-like. At the time Matthew was written, the ideas that are in there, in the broad strokes, are extremely well worn. The idea that a special person is born and they have divine parents, basically anybody who's anybody has that. I was starting to try, make a list of people in antiquity that were alleged that, and when I was putting in alphabetical order, I just even realized, let me just stop. This is going to take way too long. But, like Alexander the Great, very obviously, is said to be a son of Zeus or Ammon. Asclepius, similarly. Augustus is supposed to have parentage going Well, he's adopted by Julius Caesar, who's himself, supposed to be a descendant of Venus, and so on. There's usually in these sorts of birth stories various signs and prophecies going on, stories that such and such a person will come about, or there are signs at his birth. When Alexander was born, there was temples falling apart in Ephesus that were being interpreted as signs of a world conqueror coming. When Augustus was born, there were supposed to be signs in Rome that was indicating things. When Mithridates was born, it was said that there was a comet seen in the sky. When Moses was born, not only do we have, various versions of this, in particular in Josephus, there was actual prophecies that there was going to be this leader of the Jews coming about. And in other later sources, there also suggests that there was a star at Moses' birth. So basically, all sorts of, signs and symbols going around trying to announce something important is happening. And, attempts on the life of that person. Again, Augustus, allegedly the Senate was going to kill all babies born in the year he was born. That
Yep.
sounds a little familiar. Cyrus the Great, the story was told of as well. Moses, again, and his version of the story also seems to be riffing on the story of Sargon Akkad, who also was supposed to have been, nearly killed as a baby, but sent off to basically be saved by being in a basket going down a river. Again, by the time the New Testament is written, these tropes are old, old, old. In fact, you can find versions of this sort of story going back to the Old Kingdom of Egypt. This sort of thing is basically as old as the pyramids.
And one little comment, if I can just add with Augustus that you said.
Oh, yeah.
It's the lightning that struck the wall, and the people were actually realizing that nature was going to bring forth the king. As I have it showing up for people who want to see the screen, it's just Suetonius, Lives of the Caesars. And then remember me and you talked one night, and I was like,
Yeah.
maybe it wasn't a star at his birth, but it was definitely like a flame that went up into the sky in the temple. I can't remember exactly the details, but it's like not an identical parallel, but there's some stuff that's going on that's very similar.
Yeah, when I read that passage in particular, Suetonius, in the Latin, it suggests that there's actually some sort of sign in the city of Rome itself, so something a little bit more local rather than something astronomical. But nonetheless, it's still the same basic trope. Things are showing up in nature that are trying to indicate, hey, be on the lookout, cool stuff's going to happen. So I don't want to get too much into these details because, one, your audience either already knows this, or two, they're going to know this by watching Bart Ehrman's presentation from last night.
And some of these things he didn't get into specifically, like in any detail there. So maybe down the road we can actually put a magnifying glass on each character.
Very good, very good. Yeah, and if they come up in Q&A, I'll do my best to talk about these various folks, or non-folks, as the case might be. Very well. All right, but like I say, these might be the tropes that Matthew is familiar with, but how did he actually go about and turn this into an actual story? It's not just a bunch of and then this, and then this, and then this. It's much more creatively structured, and in particular, the way he's structuring it is going to be a technique. It's a term that's probably come up on MythVision a few times, this term Pesher. And it's well known in studies of the Dead Sea Scrolls in particular, and it's this strategy of trying to take the Old Testament and use a strategy of looking and comparing different parts and figuring out ways of putting it together to get new modern insights. So the old context doesn't matter so much. By doing this almost Bible code sort of thing, we can get new information. But it's a little bit different than like the Bible code that's shown like on the History Channel, where it's literally just looking at text and trying to find random words to pull out. This is actually a much more strategic method for doing this. It's basically you are going through and you're reading through a text in something called continuous Pesher, and you're basically reading through a text. Maybe it's Isaiah, maybe it's Habakkuk, things like that, and you're going through and like each of the verses or a couple of verses, you're looking at the themes of it or the key words and seeing where that theme or keyword shows up in another text, and then bring those together to interpret them together in that way. So it's not just random grab bag, it's actually much more methodical in that sort of approach. And the things I'm going to try to show about that today is coming from this particular article by James Patrick. It's from over a decade ago, and it's basically showing here's the nature of the Pesher technique as we can reconstruct it, and how Matthew seems to use this throughout his gospel. But I'm going to just again focus on the nativity portion of it. So I do recommend this full article, but it's basically 2 pages that I'll be focusing on the most when it comes to this. And to see how noting the strategy that he's using is going to go from Matthew looks like he's just kind of a fool and just grabbing things that doesn't care about context versus no, he actually knows and understands the context, and using this technique is how he can actually create a new interesting theological story. And as this article notes, that most of these Peshers are going to be on Isaiah, and if you're reading the nativity story, there's one quotation from Isaiah that just stands out, and I think you probably know which one that is.
Isaiah 7:14.
Exactly. And so this is how Matthew renders that verse. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and his name shall be called Emmanuel. Now, again, I don't want to step on the toes of what Bart probably said last night, but it's an extremely well-known thing that there are problems with the way Matthew has read this. The original Hebrew doesn't necessarily justify that this woman is a virgin. The tenses doesn't suggest this is something that a conception is going to happen in the future. Lots and lots and lots of things. And of course, in the original context of Isaiah, this is about not some woman 800 years in the future. It was basically a woman that was probably in the same room Isaiah was in when he was describing his prophecy to the king. It's clear that Matthew is taking his story and divorcing it from that original context. And of course, by taking the Greek version rather than the Hebrew, and this quote-unquote mistranslation of the word Alma instead of treating as Betula and turning it into Parthenos. Like I say, a lot of this is probably well known to the audience, and it would suggest that, okay, Matthew doesn't even know or care or understand what the original context was. I'm going to contend that actually Matthew does know this context, and he is using it to actually craft his story. So if we actually go to the general context of who is this child in Isaiah 7, and what's the greater theme of what's going on in there. So this child is supposed to be of the Davidic line. This seems to be indicated in multiple places in Isaiah, including the verse just before the quote-unquote virgin birth prophecy. And this king that Isaiah is predicting, this child who will become king, is being contrasted with other kings, and this will be important. And the general theme that you see over and over again here is the return from exile, in particular the Israelites who are no longer basically part of the greater kingdom. They're not part of the kingdom of Solomon that's divided off. They're now with Assyria, the Israelites in the north. But the prophecy is that they will come out of exile, they will all come together, and all these great things will happen, including the destruction of those evil kings, while the child being prophesied is still young. So key things here are exile, the reconciliation and coming together of God's people, and this will all happen while the child is still young, and the evil kings will be destroyed as the new Davidic king basically comes into himself. So far, so good?
Oh, yeah.
All right. So this is the general context. Do we see Matthew showing awareness and use of this? So first off, let's go to the most boring part of the whole story, the genealogy. Just, this list of names of who begat whom. And I have to admit, when I first was trying to get into biblical studies, open up Genesis, I get to the begats, I snore, and it took me years to try again to actually understand the Bible. That was a great way to make sure I never learned anything. But if we go to the genealogy, as been noted by Matthew himself, Jesus' genealogy consists of 3 sets of 14 ancestors. He particularly highlights this. And why the number 14? As been noted, if you look at the name David in Hebrew, Daud, and add together the letters in the form of gematria, adding together letter values, you get the number 14. So Jesus comes after David, David, David. It's basically screaming how Davidic he is. The other thing, though, to note is how that set of 3 14s is broken up. It goes from Abraham to David, David obviously being important, David to exile, and then from exile to Jesus. Notice here, it's not counting from David to another ancestor, but to an event. That's an interesting thing that's changing here in how he's highlighting this genealogy. He's going through, he's citing person after person after a person, but he's saying the main dividing thing between the second to last and last set of 14 is the Babylonian exile. And that's, of course, not the Babylonian, but exile more generally, is a theme, that theme of return from exile that we see in Isaiah. So Matthew is already choosing to say there is something about the exile that's important here, that Jesus is basically the end of that exile, the combining together of the Jewish people again for their Davidic king.
Really makes a lot of sense what you're saying, especially if you take to account Matthew 10, Matthew 15, when he continuously says, like, I came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel to regather the children of Israel. Like, he's, in fact, even in Matthew 1:21, I think it is, where he says he came to save his people from their sins, and his people would be the Jewish people. So he's there to do exactly like you're talking about, bring them back.
Exactly. Though I will also note, there is also a Gentile connection that we will note later, both with the beginning and end of the story, but I can't spoil everything right now.
Cool. Excited.
All right. So thematically, there's an interesting connection between Isaiah 7 and the nativity story in Matthew, but this is hardly the only connection across there. If we continue to go through and look at the verses after the virgin birth prophecy, Isaiah talks about judgment against Ephraim and Judah, but then their final return, their final reconciliation together. So in the strategy of the Pesher technique, if you're reading through and you say, okay, the theme here is return from exile, and it's going to relate to Ephraim. So you're going to say, all right, where else in the Hebrew Bible does it talk about Ephraim and exile or return from exile? Well, if you go to Hosea 11, you actually find just that, where Ephraim is said he's going to be coming out of exile. In particular, you get the statement, out of Israel I have called my son. Mm-hmm. This might sound a little familiar because it's directly cited by Matthew.
Which is fair to say that Matthew knows Hosea. Simple as that, he's reading this text.
Exactly. And in that case, also, if we're looking else for other places, where else is Ephraim talked about returning from exile? And we find that also happening in Jeremiah 31. And in Jeremiah 31, there's also the statement about Rachel looking for her lost children. She's crying because they're lost. But then the promise is that actually they are going to be found in return. But if you are noticing, hey, Jeremiah 31:15, that's also directly quoted by Matthew chapter 2, verse 18. In this case, Rachel's supposed to be crying about the slaughter of the innocents, who are, the babies killed by King Herod. But again, we are seeing, look at the strategy that Matthew is using. If he is using the Pesher technique, Isaiah is talking about Ephraim coming from out of exile. Here are these two passages about Ephraim coming out of exile and being put together to create the narrative. This is now looking much less like just a bunch of random verses that Matthew's getting. He actually has a strategy for choosing these verses.
Even if it is plucking out of the context to create it, he has a mission in mind, is your point. And another thing, we may just call the author Matthew for the sake of convenience. Don't take that to the bank. So, And another thing I want to say is, just because he has Hosea here and he quotes this part, I'm not saying, I don't know whether he has the whole book of Hosea or if he just has sections of it. Doesn't matter to me. We see where he's lifting it from. So at least imagine in the context in this area, he knows. So.
Right. And actually a good call that we keep calling the author Matthew, but yeah, we don't. Well, he doesn't say what his name is. I have it on good authority. He likes to be called Marty. No. But like I say, he definitely has a religious goal here, and he is removing these verses from their original context. But his strategy is not random because it's actually following this Jewish interpretive technique that had been going on for at least a century by the time Matthew came along and applied it himself to his gospel story. So that's where I'm saying that these choices are not random. They're not just being plucked out of nowhere. This is actually following strategy of interpretation that was very much in vogue amongst Jewish interpreters of the Hebrew Bible. Matthew's basically saying, I can do that too. Let's see if I can do it even better. And of course, if we're continuing to go through the Isaiah passage, we're going to find also more connections to these sorts of things. So for example, Isaiah 7:13, is specifically talking about the restoration of, to the throne of David, that David is going to, one of his ancestors will be on the throne and basically in charge again after this return from exile out of Assyria. In particular, most of that is connected to Ephraim coming out of Assyria. Well, if we are looking for a ruler to come out, where are we told about a ruler coming out? In particular, a Davidic ruler. In Matthew, we are saying, well, he is born in Bethlehem to fulfill the prophecy in Micah 5:2, that out of Bethlehem will come this ruler that will shepherd the people of Israel. And also, if we were looking for more examples of a Davidic person who will come out of exile, and even more specific to exile related to Assyria, being listed among the places that the exiles will come out of, we see that later on in Isaiah itself, in Isaiah 11, where it talks about the branch from Jesse that will be part of, that basically will rise up and bring the people out of exile. That word branch in Hebrew is netzer, and based on this Pesher technique, it seems to me that this might be the most likely cause of where Matthew is saying he's getting this prophecy that, it says in the Bible that the Messiah, he will be a Nazarene. It's been very hard to find where he's actually getting this, and my suggestion is, based on using this technique and the word choice here, it's probably the best case that the he will be a Nazarene prophecy comes from Isaiah 11:1. The Netzer from Jesse, the Nazarene from Jesse, in that sort of transliteration. Now, if we keep going with the theme, there's, again, one of the things in Isaiah 7 is also the contrast between the holy Davidic king and the non-Davidic, the evil kings out there, including a king of the Israelites, but is being seen as contrast and as evil compared to the Davidic heir that Isaiah is prophesying about. So we have this contrast between the evil king and the Davidic king, and it's also worth noting that, like I say, the evil king is an Israelite with also backing from another foreign king from Assyria, that are going against the royal house of Judah, against the Davidic line. But also Isaiah says that these kings will be defeated while the child is still young. So that child that's being prophesied about, before the child knows what's right and wrong, knows the difference between good and evil, those kings will be, put asunder, basically. Well, let's go back to our friend Matthew, and what is his story? His story is about the birth of a Davidic heir, the true king of the Jews, against the person who is faultily trying to claim and have control of the Jewish throne, and also with the help of outside help, like the Roman Empire helping Herod stay in power. Herod and then his son Archelaus are basically seen as these evil figures that are trying to stamp out the fledgling child. But what happens in the story? Not only does Jesus escape, but before Jesus is even a grown man, while he's still young, Herod dies, and Jesus is able to return from his exile. He comes out of Egypt, as the prophecy says, and he's able to come out of Egypt where he'd been hiding because Herod already kicked the bucket. So again, we see over and over again the themes, the word play connections that are happening here. We are seeing a rather continuous Pesher on Isaiah 7 being used to flesh out the narrative in Matthew. So that's why I'm going to be saying that Matthew is showing that he is really truly a composer. He's an auteur. He is able to structure things together rather than just trying to find any sort of random thing he can put together to show just how awesome Jesus is. He is going through and performing this Pesher technique based on the themes, the wordage, the contrast that we are finding in there to flesh out his narrative. And I'll also note one last thing also that you see in Isaiah 7:11. This verse, "Ask a sign for the Lord your God, let it be deep as Sheol or high as heaven." If you were going back to Matthew and you were looking for a sign high as heaven, what would you have come to mind? Our friend the Star of Bethlehem, perhaps. Once again, it very much looks like Matthew is not just randomly or doing mere post factum attempts to make Jesus fulfill prophecy. He is actually creating his narrative based on a way that Jews in the late 1st or early 2nd century created prophecy by that Pesher technique. It's a strategy that we can actually show in evidence and see him actually applying it in this particular case, and in the article that I had cited, being used throughout the gospel as well, with other passages from Isaiah for that.
You know what? Oh, it makes me think of the Christian fundamentalists who say like exegesis, exegesis, exegesis. And it's like Pesher, Pesher, Pesher. It's like, and so are you allowed to do Pesher? Stay away from those liberal scholars, I used to get told all the time. Maybe you should stay away from the Gospels then, because they're definitely liberal in the sense that they are creating what they're creating. Anyway, please continue. I'm just
No,
in the corner over here.
No, that's actually a really good point. It's like, if you're going to say, hey, no, you can't do exegesis or eisegesis, that's heresy stuff. It's like, well, you better throw out the New Testament, because that's what the whole thing is. All right. So I hope at this point you can already start to see that Matthew is showing that he has both literary and theological chops. But I haven't, of course, explained the whole story and all of his particular choices. In particular, I haven't explained his choice of using Magi in that story. But to answer this question, I'm going to have to take a bit of a pause, because I imagine we've already developed some super chats at this point.
Actually, we haven't, but we'll take a quick commercial break just to say I post this to Patreon, and if you're a Patreon fan, thank you. Quick commercial break. Join the Patreon, help support us. I'm constantly working. I've got ridiculous amount of content that I'm editing, and I need to get up there, and I'm working on it. And you can private harass me, not just private chat. You can private harass me. I am allowing it. But yeah, do that. And then also yesterday we did the Join Bart Ehrman for a special Christmas season lecture, Other Virgin Births in Antiquity, and that was phenomenal as well. We've got some stuff coming. So thank you for that little commercial break. And Dr. Adair does something a little bit different than other scholars, where he presents his case and purposely makes breaks for any Q&A along the way. Feel free to super chat your questions. We will get to them along the path. We got one right now, actually, already.
All right.
So just as we were speaking, but I'm saying get them. We will get to them. I already wrote down some questions in case others don't ask it, but we'll get there. Doc Pleuromenot in the house. Hallelujah. Everybody, clap your hands. An angel got its wings through this super chat. What astrological tradition would a Zoroastrian priest have during the time of the Nativity? Seems a later practice than imposed on Magi. Fraudulent wonder workers? A dangerous Matthean association with Jesus indeed?
Yeah, you're highlighting two important things there. That one, the term Magi, Magus, in antiquity at this, in the Greco-Roman era, had already picked up some very strong negative connotations. Basically, wonder workers or frauds. Basically, all the negative associations that you could have with, not so much wizard. I'm trying to think what's the most negative magic word in English.
Sorcerer?
Sorcerer, there. Yeah, I think that's probably the most negative with that association, especially with the sense of being a fraudster, or things like that. But the term is more broad. Originally, this is supposed to be referring to a priesthood of the Zoroastrian religion in primarily Persia. And the question about what astrological traditions did they have in the first century at the time that Matthew's supposed to be writing. We actually know reasonably well what their astrological tradition was. They didn't have one. They actually were against astrology. And once astrology was being brought into the Persian Empire in the 3rd century AD, they were like, oh, no, we're not going to have anything to do with this. They thought like all the planets were evil because the way they moved around in semi-random ways, the way they wandered about, they were corrupted by Ahriman, the Zoroastrian equivalent of the devil. So
Wow.
if they saw a moving star like is described in the Gospel of Matthew, they would have said demon, not Messiah. Wait, Messiah? Why do we care about Jewish messiahs again? I thought we were Zoroastrian.
Right.
Yeah, little details like that. So to answer Doc's question, the Zoroastrian priests probably didn't have any real astrological tradition relating to the planets at this time. They did have some worship of some stars, like they had hymns to the star Sirius, but they weren't using it for prophecy in that sort of way, and they only much, much, much later started actually doing any astrological theory themselves. And why use the word Magi? That's exactly what we're going to be doing in part 2.
Thank you, Doc. You always come through, and I really appreciate your questions, your support. It means a lot to me. It really does. And everybody in the chat liking the video, dropping comments, having discussions, debates, things like that in the chat. Type a 1 if you're loving this so far in the chat. Type a 2 if it's irritating you because you just don't like how this is going. Dr. Adair, feel free to continue. I really appreciate it.
All right. By the way, I interpret if you write a 2, I'm just interpreting that as 2 1s.
Right.
Yeah, I am most terrible. All right, let me return to presentation mode. And huzzah. Okay.
Thank you for the ones, everybody. I really appreciate it.
All right. Yes, keep my ego going. I need to keep pumping it. All right. So, the word of the day is going to be Magi. Is where our word magic is going to be ultimately derived from. That association with sorcery or understanding prophecy and things like that. And traditionally, there are supposed to be the 3 wise men, the 3 magi that came to Jesus, like in this mosaic from the 6th century, where you see they have their names Balthasar, Melchior, and Gaspar. And if you're thinking, wait, I thought it was Casper, you're right. Someone in the manuscript tradition made a typo, and the name changed because of that. Details. But yeah, why in the world would Matthew choose the particular name of Magi? Why does he want to associate these particular characters to Jesus? Now, you might be saying, well, weren't the Magi supposed to be related to astrology and star worship and things like that? Well, historically at this time that would be faulty, but also they're not like the only group in the East that would do that. In fact, it's interesting that Matthew goes out of his way to say that these are Magi from the East, that he has to also specify where they're from. If, on the other hand, if he said Chaldeans, it would have been much clearer. They had an even more clear association with astrology, with Babylon and that. If you say Magi, you have to also specify, oh, you mean the Zoroastrian type, the ones in the East there. So the fact that he had to go out of his way to even explain what kind of Magi he's talking about seems a little bit weird. He is making a deliberate choice when he could have made other ones. So why talk about Magi? If you are thinking, well, where do they come up in the Old Testament? Because as we've established earlier, Matthew's pretty big on that book. You know, it's probably one of his favorites. He probably goes to sleep every night next to a bunch of scrolls. Where in the various scrolls of the Hebrew Bible are you going to find the Magi? Now, if you're looking for them in the Hebrew scrolls, you will find them nowhere. The term magos is Greek. So if we're looking in the Greek version, the Septuagint or other equivalent Greek versions, there's only one book in the Old Testament in Greek that has the word magos being used. And that is in the book of Daniel. So using the terminology of Daniel makes one wonder, is Matthew trying to bring the larger Daniel story in? And to show that not only does Matthew, of course, know the story, but he also seems to be modeling on it, it's been noted in particular, Richard Carrier wrote this really useful article about the connections between the story of Daniel and the lion's den and the empty tomb story. That it seems to use a lot of the phraseology and thematic connections to basically create that narrative. Like in particular, when the stone is rolled over and the way it's sealed, the word for seal is the same used for how Daniel was sealed up in the den of lions as well. And of course, Daniel having his final victory over death in that the lions decided to, not turn him into food, as the story goes. Of course, the other part of the story is that the people who originally accused Daniel get their comeuppance to those same lions. But that's obviously another story. So like I say, Carrier's already made this, I think, plausible argument that Daniel is part of the strategy of creating the empty tomb narrative. And interesting as well, in the Daniel the Lion's Den story, there are the enemies within the court that are going against Daniel. The Magi are never mentioned as being part of that plot against him. Why that is may not be so clear why the original author did that, but the interesting thing is, if Matthew is already using Daniel and he's now talking about the Magi in Daniel, what are these Magi doing in the story for Matthew? What is it that they show that they are knowing? And Now, when the Magi show up, the first thing they ask is, where is the one born king of the Jews? That's the first thing. So clearly they are expecting a Jewish king, that he is a king. But they know more than just that. Because if you look at the gifts of the Magi, say it with me now, gold, frankincense, and myrrh.
Gold,
not to be confused with
and
gold,
myrrh.
Frankenstein, and myrrh. Now, if you're looking for why those particular gifts, one could jump elsewhere. So in Isaiah 60, it says, kings will come to the rising brightness of Israel, and they will come bearing gifts of gold and frankincense. So this tradition of the three kings bringing gold and frankincense to this light following the rising star, it looks like, yeah, it's again doing some Pesher stuff with Isaiah 60, but Isaiah 60 only talks about gold and frankincense. Myrrh isn't in that list, and it's really hard to find what verse Matthew could be using for myrrh, but what is myrrh actually used for? Among its uses for ritualistic purposes is embalming the dead. In other words, when the Magi come and they also bring a gift that's meant for corpses, they're basically bringing movie spoilers. They seem to be knowing what's going on later in the story, almost like the author knows his own story. And of course, it's also in Daniel that we have the prophecy of the 70 weeks of years, which includes the cutting off of the Messiah. So which group of people are going to know about the death of the Messiah? Maybe people who were in the court with Daniel, those Magi who, again, are only mentioned in this story in Daniel. They're not mentioned in any other Old Testament story. So this gives some plausibility that the reason he's making this choice is he's trying to connect the Daniel story and the Daniel prophecies to Jesus this way. More interestingly, though, it also then seems to be connecting what happens to Jesus at the end of the story to the beginning. Now, this looks a little bit vague, but I would like to show a few lines of evidence that actually Matthew is purposefully creating his narrative to basically have the beginning and the end parallel each other in, again, some larger, grander literary structure.
I also think it's fun and interesting how they take the liberty to capitalize on things that aren't obvious. Like you talked about, the Magi in Daniel, you know, it's like the Melchizedek priest, right? Like it's such a mystery that they can like take liberty of inventing meaning and purpose and stuff about Melchizedek later because you don't know much about him. So there's this liberty to say, oh, this is what was really going on, or this is what it meant, or all of that fun stuff.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, especially what they do with Melchizedek in the Second Enoch. There's like an extra add-on where basically Enoch has his own miraculous birth because it's like everyone's got to have one. All right, so like I say, I'm going to now lead into some evidence that actually Matthew is doing even more hardcore literary work. And he's using a strategy that's well known in Greco-Roman literature and also in more modern literature, having little indications of callbacks from one point in the story to the other. And one of the little things that people probably forget because it seems so much an aside, it doesn't have much relevance to the plot, but if you read the 4 canonical Gospels, there's the trial with Pilate, but only in Matthew do we actually, find out that Pilate is married and his wife is around. Because she basically pops in and says, hey, maybe you shouldn't bother this guy. I had a dream about this. Matthew's also the big person, like the only big author who's really big on this whole dream element. It's kind of obvious where it starts with Joseph, Jesus' father, that he gets multiple dreams. And of course, one can't help but parallel that with the patriarch Joseph, the interpreter of dreams. And of course, Joseph in the nativity story goes to Egypt, just like the other Joseph. So it's like, again, lots of obvious parallelism. So that he's an interpreter of dreams is interesting. The Magi also get dreams. They are also told in a dream to basically not stick around and go a different way back home because of, how angry Herod was going to be. And you don't hear anything else about people getting dreams until just about at the end of the story in the basically the trial scenes and Pilate's wife coming in saying, hey, I had a dream about this. So this is like some indication, hey, when was the last time dreams came up? Oh, that was a while ago, wasn't that? It's some sort of callback. And that's not the only example of a callback. And when I say callback, the more technical term is an inclusio, like a particular word or phrase or theme that basically helps indicate that something is being repeated or being alluded to again later on. And the other inclusio that's usually seen somewhat obvious is at the beginning of the story of Jesus, we are told in that prophecy that he will be called Emmanuel. And you have to say, well, when's the next time Jesus is called Emmanuel? How many other times does that show up? Well, if you're checking, he's called Jesus a bunch of times, but he's never called Emmanuel again. But there is something else worth noting. When Matthew cites that prophecy and says his name will be Emmanuel, he then says, and what Emmanuel means is God will be with us. God is with us. What is Jesus' last statements before he leaves for the heavens? I am with you always. The end is calling back to the beginning. And as I've mentioned before, the Magi are bringing gifts of myrrh, which is used for embalming corpses. So again, it looks like there's these multiple indications that there's something going on at the end of the story that's parallel to the beginning, or vice versa. And like I say, some of these are maybe small touches, small word choices here and there. But even more grandly, we can actually see many examples of the beginning and end very purposely seeming to parallel each other. So, for example, Jesus is called the King of the Jews, and this is actually first stated by Gentiles. The first people to call Jesus the King of the Jews are the Magi. The next time Jesus gets called King of the Jews is by Pilate. In the middle, no one else is calling Jesus King of the Jews. So, Gentiles at the beginning and at the end using that title for Jesus. Jesus' enemies assemble together to plot against him. And again, using the same Greek word in both cases. The scribes and priests are assembling together. In the first case, they are assembling together with Herod to basically figure out, where the Messiah is supposed to be born. And later in chapter 28, they're assembling together to figure out what lie are they going to tell about the empty tomb. Again, plotting together to ultimately take down the Messiah. And even using the same term for that assembling together. Also, at the beginning and the end, there are bright lights that are standing on or upon structures. And again, using the same Greek word and grammatical structure. In Matthew 2:9, it's a star that stops and stands over the house that Jesus is in. In the empty tomb story, it's an angel that opens up the tomb and then sits upon the opened door. Again, using that same structure, and the angel is said to be very luminescent, very bright. So two bright objects doing the same thing with the same kinds of terminology. Already, again, interesting parallelism. It gets even more dense when we are looking for the search for Jesus. In the beginning, it's the Magi who are searching for Jesus. At the empty tomb story, it's the women who are looking for their Jesus. And in both cases, when they find their Jesus, they are filled with joy. They are both following instructions, using the same terminology there. And in both cases, when the Magi and when the women find Jesus, they get down and prostrate themselves to Jesus. And again, using the same terminology. Again, seeing these parallels in both cases over and over and over again. And lastly, the whole point of the Magi is the fact that they are Gentiles. And what's the Great Commission happening at the very end? Make disciples of all nations. Go out to the non-Jews and also bring them into the next super nation or kingdom of God, I should say. So lots and lots of purposeful parallelism between the beginning and the end. One is being used to help structure the other. And this, again, looks like literary craftsmanship, not just random things being put together.
Mm-hmm.
So when come Christmas time and you're looking at your creche, the story is supposed to be about the birth. But what I would say is when you're looking at this story, what Matthew is really wanting you to look forward to is what happens at the end of the story as well, which of course is even the most important for Matthew. So when you're thinking about Christmas, you should also be thinking about Easter. So I say celebrate both holidays at once. It's what Matthew might have intended you to do. That's the big presentation for today. Thank you.
Wow, that was really fun. You got me thinking of that that nativity art. I don't know who drew it, but there's like the scene with Jesus in the cradle there as an infant, and there's like a crucifix in the corner hanging
Yeah.
up, and it's like, hey, spoiler, hey, it's about his death,
Yep.
and of course his overcoming death is the whole notion. I'm trying to find it on Google. I figured I'd share it to give people a laugh.
Yeah, I think there's also a Da Vinci painting as well with Jesus and John the Baptist, and I think Jesus is like holding a cross or like a stick cross in his hand as well, so he's contemplating his future. And of course, as everyone else is like, "Hey, dude, spoilers!"
It is. Man, someone had it and circled it. It was like, hey,
Yeah.
we're letting you know. Which
I know the
tells
meme
you,
you're talking about.
yeah, and it kind of tells you like it's really easy. We were talking about this earlier. Actually, James Apperson, he's in the chat right now. He's got a YouTube channel. Go subscribe if you really want to get part of the community and go check him out. Of course, subscribe to Dr. Aaron Adair. I pinned his YouTube to the top of the chat. Give us a 1. Again, if you enjoyed the presentation, give us a 1. If you didn't, throw a 2. Or if you're just like, I'm not a fan of this, or you have your disagreements, throw a 2 up. I want to hear what the chat thinks about the presentation. And so Dr. Adair's ego can get bigger and bigger.
Careful, because again, scientists, if the ego gets too large, it will collapse into a black hole, and then we're all in trouble.
This is true. So be mindful of that when you put your number out there so we can check you out in the chat. But we were talking about this earlier, and, we could easily see other religions when we're within one and find problems because it's not our own worldview, which is why the scientific method, I think, is so important to try and look for problems in your own stances. This is such a good methodology to have. But I'm looking at this and I'm going, well written, whoever you are, well written. And the clues are there from the beginning of this story. The most probable is that this is constructed as fiction, or at least to some degree historical fiction.
Yeah.
I can't say everything that is listed there didn't happen, but there's good reasons to say, should we think this written the way it is and what's said happened? You know what I mean?
Yeah. To abuse slightly a bit of a quote from George Lucas, when it comes to stories, the ones that come after, they're not identical, but they rhyme. Stories rhyme. History doesn't. History doesn't try to go out of its way and repeat itself in that same sort of highly structured way. So it's at the very least not what you would expect if it's just an account of things that happened.
You're not lying. This is what, like, big red flags are coming up. And I like the story. Like, can I not like the story? Can I not think, wow, this is cleverly written,
Yeah.
But we do not devise cleverly devised myths, as one of the later texts says. Maybe they don't agree with Matthew. I don't know.
Or maybe they didn't think it was all that clever.
Right. I have questions.
Yeah, I will note one point though, that it's also worth noting the human stuff here. And while I've shown how good Matthew is as a writer, he also, of course, makes flubs. Probably the most obvious flub is he didn't count correctly. I mentioned those 3 sets of 14. If you go through and you count, you get 14, 14, 13.
Yeah.
Whoops.
Casper the Friendly Descendant. That's what they forgot. Absolutely. Let's get to Q&A, and then if we don't cover the questions I have, we'll spend my time at the end getting into those if we have the time. Sort of a half-joke question. Thank you so much for the support. Do you think the first gospel of the infancy of Jesus Christ, written by high priest Joseph, sometimes called Caiaphas, was the first written account of Jesus' birth?
There seems to be a context here that I'm not picking up. I'm a little bit confused by the question. That is the suggestion that, is it the case that someone is suggesting that there was a birth narrative about Jesus written by the high priest in the 1st century? I'm not quite sure.
This is a good question. Is there later pseudepigrapha written saying something like this?
The closest I can think of is for example, in the Protevangelium of James, the Infancy Gospel of James, it has like a combination of story of Mary's birth, story of Jesus' birth, connection with John the Baptist, and John the Baptist's father is supposed to be a high priest in there as well, and things like that. Maybe that's what you're going before, but there's also another infancy narrative that isn't so well published, in part because most of the manuscripts we have about it are in Old Irish, and it seems to be much more centered on Joseph and his kind of side of things. It's still obvious that that author is using Matthew and Luke, but it's much more Joseph centric in that case. And unfortunately, this story doesn't even have a good name. Like when I've looked at the research on this, they just call it the new source. So it's it's not going to sell any books with a name like that. Maybe that's what Hammond is going for. If you want to give some more context, so I can, even if you say it's a half joke, I would love to do a better job of more than quarter answering.
Right, right. I feel you. Thank you for the super chat, Hammond. I do want to just say bye to PC1, because everything you've said today is nonsense, Dr. Adair. I mean, like, you literally just don't see that the way it was written is what happened. I've seen their comments before. Like, duh, don't you just accept hook, line, and sinker the Kool-Aid that people hand you and tell you to drink? I mean, what is wrong with you? Sorry, I'm not trying to be so personal towards you, Dr. Adair, but the fact that you have to turn on your thinking critical skills is ridiculous to me. But anyway, we'll continue the Q&A. I'm just pointing out your flaws here, okay?
Yeah, hold on, I need a needle because you just popped my balloon.
Okay. Okay, cool. You're uninflated now, or deflated, better yet. Doc Pluromana, thank you so much again for the love, being here and being Doc. Let's cut Matt a little slack. If you pick a random star, point at the horizon, and predict that there's a baby about to be born in that direction, stats are on your side.
True. Especially if you're allowed to walk indefinitely, then yes. I also have to add to this are you familiar with the webcomic XKCD?
Webcomic?
Yes.
No, I'm
okay.
Sorry.
So I guess it's maybe too much for nerds like myself. It's much more usually math, science jokes in it. But in this webcomic, one of the things that the author put together. So the author's name is Randall Munroe. And he's written a couple of books now called What If, where he gets like random science questions like, what if you were playing baseball and the baseball was thrown at you at relativistic speeds? What would sort of, effects would that have? Things that seem a bit crazy, but you realize I could do the math on that. One of the things that Munroe does is if you were just following a random star and following it absolutely literally, what kind of path would you take as like mapped out on the Earth? And depending on if you're following a star in the sky versus a planet or the sun, you end up like doing all these like weird cycles. Some of them will like have you like do little helixes taking you up to the North Pole or the South Pole and things like that. It shows that if you are being hyper literal, you could end up getting your feet wet.
Right. And that's a good one. Doc, thank you so much. You're right, man. Anybody could go and find a savior that way. JC, what is your opinion on the synoptic problem and gospel dating, and where does this analysis fit? Great presentation. Thank you.
All right. So when it comes to the synoptic problem, I probably most align with the arguments of Mark Goodacre. I don't see the necessity for Q, at least for the relationship between Matthew and Luke. To me, it looks very likely that Luke knows Matthew and is using it to some degree to create his own narrative. In fact, in my own analysis, I also think Luke is also aware of Matthew's nativity story, and he's changing things on purpose. He's definitely not going to keep some things around, like, for example, the Magi. They have to go because Luke is clear in other parts, and like in Acts, Magus people are no, I'm not going to have any good ones in my story. They have to be flushed down the theological toilet.
I like that.
So that's my current position. I will admit, though, I have not read the most recent work by Dennis MacDonald to defend his Q plus Papias hypothesis. Mm-hmm. So I can't critically assess and tell you if it's good or bad. Again, haven't read, but he also agrees Luke knows Matthew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's better than the two source hypothesis, in my opinion, that there's communication here. I'm with you, but there's also the position that the birth narrative, the first few chapters of Luke, were inserted later. And that gets into this later thing with Marcion and Irenaeus and like, what the heck? So you're opening a can of worms, and here you are turning on your thinking skills again. You need to keep the needle nearby. You just need to because it's insane what you're doing. As far as dating goes, though, do you
Yeah.
have?
So dating is impossible. It's a book. You can't have a meaningful relationship with it. There's no way you can go out and like buy it flowers and chocolates and things. Oh, I'm sorry, a different dating.
Yeah, yeah. You pop too
I
much. Yeah.
yeah. I have no real confidence in when the books were written, so I take extremely wide error margins. Mark knows about the destruction of the temple, so it's post 70. The earliest clear reference we have to the Synoptic Gospels is in Justin Martyr in the 150s. So Mark, Matthew, Luke are written somewhere in that time, and where exactly, I'm agnostic.
Mm. Thank you. Appreciate that, JC. Good to see you, Margaret DeVelden. I appreciate you. Your name is shortened. I don't know if you've changed it or if that's how it's been, but then again, I've seen your name everywhere. And of course, you're a member. And then I think you're also a patron. There's all that good stuff. Bravo. I will share this as my token Christmas post. Thank you, Dr. Aaron Adair. Thank you.
Feeling the spirit. I'm feeling the spirit.
Gotta feel this. That's the first time I spoke tongues in months, man. It just came out. It was just, I couldn't control myself. Go subscribe to James Apperson. His YouTube is in the chat. Especially if you want like deeper, longer, like hangout conversations. They go for hours sometimes, and it's really, really interesting. Doc Pleuromanot again in the chat. I know that you have some sins you're trying to get off your chest, and this is relieving you of those. So don't worry, these indulgences will be well taken. Why accuse Jesus of being born in fornication, porneia, in John 8:41? The same reason he was called Son of Mary, Mark 6:3. Question? Huh? Identified matrilineally, legality of his mamzer versus shitukai, silenced. Status seems at play. I'm not sure about the word that one, but
yeah, I think he translated the word, and I think the context basically here is, especially in Mark, Jesus is only referred to as like a son of Mary. The father is completely absent, like just like a complete unknown entity. Mm-hmm. Is this a sign that that's because Jesus didn't actually have a proper father, that with the accusation that, yeah, Mary was impregnated by fornication or by rape or things like that? I would first think that maybe the reason Mark isn't saying anything about Jesus's biological father is because right at the beginning of the gospel, it says that Jesus is the Son of God. So that's already going to confuse things if you say he's got another daddy.
Well, an interesting note. I actually was going to write this down, but I'm glad this question came up. Bart Ehrman said something that really made me think. You can take it how you want. There's a historical kernel here. You could say that's complete mythography, as Richard Carrier might say. But in this text, Mary and the family thinks Jesus is nuts. And they're like, yo, what has gotten into you? And Bart said, hold up. Think about this. You mean to tell me she doesn't know he's the Son of God and that like he knows what he's doing? So Mark is absent and clueless, or at least is drawing his narrative as if these family members who should have known she was a virgin who gave birth to him, right? Like, how does she not know who he is? Whereas Matthew, out the gate, wants you and everyone to know he's the Son of God, born through this, relationship or the overshadowing of the pneuma of God. So, like Mark, she doesn't know that he was obviously the Son of God. It's kind of disclosed in secret over time, and that is a shocker. If he was really born of a virgin and really born of her through union with God, she would have known this and not been like, you're nuts, what's wrong with you?
Yeah, if angels are coming down announcing things to Mary directly, she is pregnant without intercourse. If people from other nations are coming and bringing gifts, and you had to escape invading armies because they're trying to come and kill you and your children, and then a few years later you forgot all that happened and that you were told that you were having the birth of the Son of God. It's like, what happened in that pregnancy that just made you completely suppress all those memories? Right. But remembered later, so that way she could join the church, because she's mentioned in Acts as part of the early church. So somehow she was immaculately conceived, grow up in the temple so that way she could be, a perfectly pure vessel for Jesus, have all these announcements by angels, all these things, then completely forget about it, and then only remembered, oh yeah, all that stuff my son was supposed to do. Now that he's finished it, now I remember. Oh yeah, he was God. Oh, silly me.
Yeah, that's the issue with trying to harmonize different texts. And I appreciate your focus on Matthew alone. Not saying we can't jumble around here in the Q&A. It's just that is important, that we read literature in its authorial context and not the only reason we might jump around is like if you think they're lifting it from somewhere, right, to try and emphasize things like we've done with this whole Pesher thing. And that's a great question, Doc. I'm curious, and this is a question plenty of questions I don't have answers to, is like what he's talking about here with this accusation of being born from fornication. What is, if it is an invented part of the narrative of John, what is the point? What are they trying to imply? I'm not sure that we have enough data to really know. Or is this a early rumor, the accusations that have come up because we see Jews later also using the argument that he is born of either Joseph or this later, accusation that we find of the Roman soldier named Panthera. Like this wasn't, according to Dr. Tabor, this wasn't a joke on virgin. I know many scholars say that, but he's like, the first time you find in history where scholars say that this is a pun on virgin is the 1900s. You don't find that in history. It's actually a Roman soldier's name. So I don't know. It's an interesting question.
Yeah, and I will also say when it comes to interpreting John's use of the term porneia there, it also will depend on when John was written, because maybe it's that John is also aware of the accusation within Jewish circles that Jesus was born out of wedlock in the way that we find in Celsus and then in the Talmudic literature and things like that. So again, it depends on when John was writing and who was in his circle and if those accusations existed in the 2nd century. Again, I don't know when John was written. He didn't provide a date.
This is a fun question. Doc, thank you so much for the support. Hammond's back. Thank you again. It's apocrypha to most modern day religions. It's implied that early 1st, 2nd century priests may have had this in sermons. In a nutshell, it tries to explain how Jesus did miracles since his birth. This is, of course, going back to the earlier point.
Right. Yeah, I have to admit that this that the idea that Caiaphas the high priest was writing about the birth of Jesus, I am completely unfamiliar with these sorts of stories, whether they are ancient, medieval, or modern. It's completely new to me. So, Hammond, I would actually appreciate it if you reached out to me so you could tell me when you first learned about this. Yeah.
I'm curious too, because this there's always something coming up, even modern forgeries, to try and like, oh, yeah, you don't think that? Oh, well, guess what? We found over here, and you never know. Thank you so much, Hammond. Mike, I almost said Mike Bender. Minder Bender. Does anything rise to the level of history in the birth narratives of Matthew and Luke?
Nothing I think that we can verify. It could be the case that it's true that Jesus was born during the last days of King Herod. That's totally possible. There's nothing impossible about that being the case. But we just really can't tell. It doesn't help that Matthew and Luke are contradictory on when Jesus was born in unreconcilable ways. And I do say unreconcilable, being aware that there's like 200 plus years of attempts to get around that problem. But that will be another conversation, to go through every single minutia of how people have tried to argue things. But because it's worth noting two things. Even if we can't show something is historical, that doesn't mean it's necessarily not true. I don't know how to take anything in the birth narratives and show that they are actually the case. So I am skeptical we can derive history from the birth narratives. And if we ever do find anything that we can verify about the birth of Jesus, it's going to have to come through some other source. Maybe we'll get lucky and we'll find his birth certificate written by Caiaphas in 1680. I don't know.
Oh, that would be fun. I think it's interesting to see how at least there seems to be an accurate portrayal of Herod to some degree, being this guy. And what I mean is this: the guy was nasty. Okay,
Hmm.
like willing to throw his own family under the bus and kill his own family that wanted to usurp him and get him off the throne, things like that. So
Yeah.
like they don't give you that detail, but whereas the Gospels inaccurately, I would say, portray Pontius Pilate. You see what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
like there's an inaccurate portrayal here of Pontius Pilate, but at least it seems the gist of Herod being this douche, it fits history to some degree, right?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, they definitely know about his character, especially towards the end of his life, where yeah, he was extra killy at that point in his life. He was truly becoming the Mad King, Mad King Aegon, I guess. I will note though that there is one historical infelicity in the way that Herod is described, though, because when the Magi come and Herod says, "Okay, go find the kid and then report back to me," he doesn't send any spies. He just completely trusts these people who just came in and say, "Hey, you aren't the king no more. There's this new baby in town. Could you point us in the way?" And Herod's just like, "I'm going to completely trust these foreigners from out of town to completely, not just, usurp me at this point." And it's also worth noting, Herod has had bad relations with the Magi and with the Persians. It's worth noting the Magi were actually part of the Parthian government, and Herod had to escape the Parthian armies and then fight back against them to take control and become "quote unquote" king of the Jews.
Right.
So his
Why would you
relationship
trust
is
them?
yeah, and according to Josephus, towards the end of his life, there was an assassination attempt against Herod, and allegedly Herod had someone confess under torture that he was actually put up to it by the Persian king. So his relationship with the empire over there was basically anywhere between no bueno and hell no.
Right. And now Nero would be a different thing because the Parthians seem to have liked, and of course there was tax free he had for the east of the empire, and like the Parthians, there's the rumors, of course, of Nero Redivivus and stuff. So that would be a different thing, and you kind of wonder if there's things like that conflate themselves in narratives. Continuing on to the next super chat, Blake. Thank you, Blake. Do the infancy narrative support some Marian dogmas, i.e., Jesus was born without going through birth canal, or Mary stayed a virgin after Jesus' birth?
Very not directly, especially since Matthew will say that Jesus has brothers or other siblings, and I don't think anyone has alleged that James was born without sexual union. That Mary was just pumping out kids without sex. I mean, there's birth control, and there's literally having absolutely no control over your body. That would be happening there. Oh my, yeah. And also, there's nothing in Matthew that seems to directly support the idea of the Immaculate Conception. That only seems to be a later church innovation to explain then how Jesus could be born without sin because Mary didn't have it, which then begs the question, if God can just turn people's sin off, why do we have to all deal with this? Once God starts making exceptions, you have to start asking questions. And, well, when it comes to the exceptions that God has made, I've made a list, and where are my hard drives? I have so many questions.
Seriously, great question. And one of the obvious to me is the euphemism "to know." Joseph knew Mary after she gave birth to Jesus. I mean, I know the Roman Catholic tradition doesn't want that to be so. She has to remain a virgin forever. But in this narrative, I'm sure there's apologists out there that find ways to bend stuff to not mean it. But Bart Ehrman mentions that, of course, also in the course when Q&A comes up. And he's like, he knew her. It's pretty obvious what "to know somebody" means when it's the husband and the wife,
Right. Have you watched the movie Dogma?
I don't know if I have. Name doesn't. Yeah.
I mean, it's a little bit dated in that it's full of very '90s references to things, but in particular, in that story there, where we're being told some details about Jesus' family from a guy named Rufus, the 13th apostle. He was one of Jesus' apostles, but he was kicked out because he was black.
You know what I just noticed I messed up too? But go ahead, finish what you're saying. I messed up and said husband and wife.
And in one of the scenes, Rufus is explaining about Jesus and his family, and he says, to believe that Jesus was born from a virgin without sexual union, that's a matter of faith. That a husband and a wife never got down, that's just straight gullible.
That's tough. Yeah, that's a tough one to swallow there. I'm not so sure. Jennifer Bird is in the chat. Go subscribe to her. But I must admit, I said husband and wife, and I'm actually curious to know if we even should be. People get my point on what I'm saying, but she has a different way of marriage in the Bible, and like the meaning of what it is. So I would refer to her actually on the meaning there. As far as making sure I covered everything there, did the infancy narrative support the Marian dogmas? Born without going to, I don't know. Neither one of Luke or Matthew seem to give any hint.
Yeah, there is the idea of like Jesus not having to go through the birth canal. That's more in some of the other pseudepigraphal infancy stories. So, for example, the Revelation of the Magi, that one seems to have basically Jesus like passing through Mary's body in a very non-natural sort of way. But there's no details like that in Matthew. It's just, the details aren't given there. There's like nothing about like afterbirth or any of those sorts of, graphical points.
Right. He was born and there was no blood or water. In fact, he came out clean, as smooth, and no blood or guts. Or I can imagine.
I should also add, though, there is the other version, the Gospel of Pseudo Matthew. In that one, Jesus, he pops out and I think he's able to walk and talk. And when the family are escaping to Egypt, they run into dragons, and Jesus is able to tame the dragons.
That makes a lot. Yeah, I was about to say that one. Now that one I might believe, but like, come on, that's more believable. I've seen Game of Thrones. I know what reality is. Marcia Jones, thank you for the super sticker, and Merry Christmas to you as well. It's Christmas, they said. I have no problem with using the word Christmas. I know there's some people who just can't stand it, but it doesn't hurt my feelings whatsoever. Fred Manskow Naimoan, forgive me if I butchered. I try sometimes, and I probably shouldn't. But thank you for the super chat. Regarding Joseph, could naming Jesus's earthly father be a deliberate callback? And is there significant symbolism in the name Mary?
Could naming Jesus' earthly father be a deliberate callback? Callback to what? I'm not sure. I do think.
I think that's the callback to Joseph's story that you were mentioning, like naming him Joseph because Joseph was the coat of many colors, and interpreter of dreams and stuff.
Oh yeah, I think that's very. There I think are multiple purposes for Joseph. One is the fact he's a dream interpreter. The fact that Joseph and the family go to Egypt. That seems like pretty glaring that, hey, there is some connection there. But also it's worth noting that we have these other traditions that are, they're referred to in later sources, but it talks about there being two messiahs, a Messiah ben David and a Messiah ben Joseph, and the Messiah ben Joseph is the one who is killed. So that seems like way more than just a coincidence. It seems like also there's some purpose in that name choice. If there is literally this tradition in Judaism that there is a Messiah born of Joseph who is killed, like, I think we've heard this story somewhere else.
Yeah, I wonder where. Good to see Jennifer Bird in the chat. Wonderful to have you in here checking us out. I mean, we made it on your radar. That's what matters here. That's what matters.
I'm very happy that Dr. Bird is in the chat because I'm sure she can teach me a lot. So if she wants to tell me what's what, I'm very receptive to hearing.
I am too, and always looking forward to working with her again. She's fantastic. The energy she brings is just, it literally is addictive. By the way, I'm running low on my, I need a hit again of that energy. So yeah. I got to call the dope man or dope woman here sometime soon to get that hit. No, joking. I've got a couple questions that I picked up along the way. And I'm hoping that our chat kind of thought about some of these things along the way. I just didn't hear any super chats pertaining to it. So I'm a nerd here with my my pencil and my pad. And you brought up Nesser, and I suspect this comes up in that article. And I know there are various ways people interpret Nazarene, Nazareth, that kind of stuff. But Netzer, you talk about being a Hebrew term. And I might as well use the gematria of David as well in the genealogy to make this note. Matthew's written in Greek. It's literally apologists later who argue that there was like a Hebrew gospel. Most scholars would say Matthew is clearly not even a translation of a Hebrew version of anything. It is just written in Greek from its origins. It appears this gospel is written in Greek. Is there any reason, especially when Matthew goofs up the accounts in Zechariah 9:9 with like getting two donkeys rather than it
Mm.
being a Hebraism where it's just a repeat of one donkey. It's just, you're just saying the same thing twice. To think that he would be playing in Hebrew gematria for David or even Netzer as a Hebrew term to somehow derive that and argue that this is Nazareth or
Yeah.
Nazarene. You see what I'm trying to get at?
I think I do. Yeah, yeah. So there's actually two things that come to mind in there. One, was there ever a Hebrew version of Matthew? I know James Tabor talks about that, and there was a book from the 80s. The author was George Howard, looking at medieval manuscripts of a uh, Hebrew version of Matthew that existed in Jewish circles at that time, and
Mhm.
arguing this actually goes back to more ancient times. And the argument there was not that Greek, or that Matthew translated from Hebrew to Greek, or the Greek of Matthew was translated to Hebrew, but maybe the same author wrote both, that he was just that bilingual that he could write both ways rather than translating between the two. I don't know the case well enough to say if it's strong or not. It's outside of my wheelhouse, especially because my Hebrew knowledge is nowhere
Right.
near strong enough to assess that. But
So you're
that's an
just
argument that's
deriving
out
it
there.
from that article, though, right? Like that's some
Um,
of this.
Yeah. Well, also just more generally, that it's been argued that this is where the term Nazareth or Nazarene might be derivative of, and it's arguable. It's not the most obvious transliteration of Netzer. Now, does Matthew know the Hebrew in the first place? So you mentioned in particular the donkeys. So yeah, it's true that the 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 rodeo clown act that Jesus must be doing, riding two donkeys, including a mother and its child, which so they're also at different heights, that somehow Jesus is riding those in. Obviously, it's a completely silly scene. Is it because, though, he doesn't understand parallelism? I don't think so, because I actually see the same thing in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, for example, if you go to the star prophecy from 24:17, a star will rise out of Jacob and a scepter out of Israel. This is also an example of parallelism. The star and the scepter are referring to the same entity. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, it actually treats them as two different entities.
Now,
That
this
they
is the donkey, or are you talking about?
well, this is an example of here's Hebrew parallelism.
Mhm.
So if you're following Hebrew parallelism, yeah, they're both referring to the same object, but later interpreter comes along and treats them as two different objects.
Right.
So, and if the Dead Sea Scroll authors can do that and they know Hebrew, then it's not so much of a stretch to imagine Matthew could do the same. But it is true that he is creating a very impossible, physically impossible scene. But I think he's just trying to go over the top, just saying how completely Jesus fulfills this prophecy, that it's going out of his way to even be hyper literal in that sort of thing. It ultimately also is signaling, hey, I don't care about plausibility. I'm just going to make sure Jesus is the
Right.
fulfillment of prophecy. I mean, and honestly, is this any more implausible than the way he read the virgin birth story? It's not like that's physically possible either. So,
Right. Right. No, this is good. I'm not critiquing.
oh, I understand.
I'm being critical though on how we're going to try and approach this because
Yeah.
it is an interesting angle, and I do need to look at the Dead Sea Scrolls because I'm curious to see how they do it. But I'm also wondering because Matthew's the only one who gets the two donkeys. Everyone
Mm-hmm.
else understood it as one, and these seem to be, I guess you call them more, what people like to say is more Gentile-like literature. Like they're more prone to be what people would say, man, Luke looks like an author that's not Jewish. But if Matthew is it common that Jews are misunderstanding their own text? Are they reading the LXX? Are they drawing this instead of Hebrew? And so I'm wondering if they're sprinkling in their little David being gematria or Netzer. The other thing I had, and we'll get to Mr. Monster super chat here in a minute. Thank you for that super chat. Maybe any other questions that come up, they'll collect. So I'm not like bouncing back and forth. Is the star, like maybe I'm an idiot and I didn't catch it, but why a star? Why have this star in this narrative? I was thinking of your work on Revelation, which I haven't read your article or even seen the presentation.
Mm.
And I think a lot of scholars see that the book of Revelation at least has some connection in some ways, seems to be aware of some of the stuff floating in early Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if they have the Gospel of Mark. I'm not sure if they have a gospel or if they're aware of some tradition here. But you talked about, how you did this presentation on the woman and the stars and this myth that we're seeing. I'm kind of wondering if there's a connection, or at least what the heck is a star doing in this narrative? Because you
Very
mentioned
good,
they're
very
not
good.
into astrology, so why is there a star?
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. So, so there's a few things in there that I should probably touch on because they're all really good things. So, one, There's actually a small amount, but interesting bit of literature that actually looks at the Book of Revelation and see where it fits into the synoptic problem,
Mm-hmm.
because there's a number of places where it looks like Revelation knows stuff in Matthew and a little bit in Luke, but especially Matthew. Um, and so the scholarship, the vast majority of the scholarship that I found in recent times argues that the author of Revelation, John of Patmos, or John of Louisiana, I don't know where he's actually at the time when he's writing, but that author seems to have some relationship with the material of Matthew. Um, Most of it, though, argues that it doesn't directly use or know Matthew. So more argues that it knows the same material. And I've tried to do my own assessment as well and agree that Revelation is not using Matthew. So either Revelation and Matthew have a common source, or Matthew is using Revelation. I can't prove the latter, so I'm just happy to accept that they have common source. But the fact of the matter is, yeah, they both have this interesting little star character. And yeah, part of my presentation at SBL was to explain where does this title of Morning Star come from, and I actually argue it's based on a different Pesher. I'm just so Peshery these days. But it's a combination that actually would explain the imagery of the woman clothed with the sun. She's basically a dawn goddess, and when she's giving birth to Jesus, he's giving birth to Jesus as that star from the star prophecy. And if you have a star being born from dawn, that gives you a morning star.
Mm-hmm.
So the question then becomes, is this also then related to the Matthew story? And this is something that I'm actually working on to try to argue that actually that is maybe the or text that Matthew is working from, that there's this old story of Jesus as the morning star, and it's now being turned into this other narrative. But this is something unique to me, which I've only hinted at in some of my published stuff, but I have not like come out with the full peer review version of an article that or a book that will make that case. It's in the works,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't have something that I would present right now and say, and this is why you should all believe me and praise me and give more ones in the chat.
Yeah, give us ones if you like what he said or what you like what he's been saying. I want to see some ones flying up in the chat. If you don't like what he says, tell him to his face. Say it like you mean it. Dr. Adair, something interesting about what you said there, and then we'll go to super chats and I'll continue my questions after, is as you were presenting this and showing they're giving you the what do you call that? Easter eggs in this birth narrative about Jesus's death. I wonder if the star coming is also kind of playing in that role. And the reason is we see Julius Caesar, at least there's a star. They see the comet or they see the star in the sky and they go, hey, he's become a god. Is this kind of a reverse role in a way of saying like he came as a god and he's leaving as a god, kind of like Pauline theology is pre-existent to some degree. It's not full on Logos John, but it's like, hey, he arrived as a star, or the star brought his arrival simultaneously because God overshadows Mary with his pneuma, and yet he's also going to leave like a star in a way. Do you think there's something to that?
I think so, and for a couple of reasons. One, I think some authors also realize that. So I mentioned the apocryphal, the Revelation of the Magi. When the star appears, and it appears to the wise men in a cave in the Far East, the star is baby Jesus. Baby Jesus literally led the Magi to baby Jesus. So like Jesus was actually in like two places at once. So he's able to move back and forth between time and space. He's able to change form. So he's a baby and he's a star at the same time. He's able to provide food to the wise men as they're traveling from the east to Bethlehem. So, it's a little bit crazy in that way, but it seems like someone is saying, hey, Jesus is this star. And the other indication to me that's a bit interesting, you mentioned Julius Caesar becoming a star. And also, I'll give another example of another person who becomes a star at his death, the lover of Hadrian, Antinous, when he drowns in the Nile and Hadrian is distraught. One of his advisors there is saying, be not so sad because Antinous' star is now in the sky and that's his soul up in heaven. So it seems like, very commonly, if someone is saying they have a star, this is his star, they're saying that person is the star. This is their spirit now existing in heaven. And the fact that actually most commenters have not picked up on in Matthew, it doesn't just say we are following a star or we have seen a star. They say we have seen his star.
Hmm.
In the same way, when it talks about Julius Caesar's star or Antinous' star, it uses the same like grammar structure there. And that's an interesting connection that again suggests to me Matthew is importing this other idea of Jesus as star into star at Jesus' birth. So I've actually, it was several months ago, I actually presented what my current version of my case is to Neil on Gnostic Informant. So you can watch what I'm trying to argue there. But again, I haven't come out with like a peer-reviewed version that should make the scholar stand up and say, "Oh, he's not completely crazy, just mostly."
Well, we got a lot of ones. Okay. So what you said, they approve. They approve. You're not going to you get the thumbs up from the emperor. That means light a candle for Julius Caesar. And who is the other person?
Oh, Antinous.
Antinous. Light a candle
Yes.
for them because they're just as true. Amen.
Yep. And also, it's worth noting, Antinous also had a cult to him that lasted for centuries.
I mean, that's kind of an important thing to consider. These stars were taken seriously. Mr. Monster, thank you for the super chat. Thank you for being a member. Thank you for being around Myth Vision for all this time. Isn't there a story where Jesus kills another child and the teacher, or is that not canon?
It's not in the canon, but it is an ancient story. It's in the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, where yeah, that Jesus basically, as an infant, is just the worst kind of brat. You know, you've probably experienced with your kids the quote unquote terrible twos. Well, imagine it's terrible twos, but with divine powers. Yeah, so Jesus gets upset and he curses kids and they die. He curses his teacher because the teacher, okay, in some ways I think the teacher had it coming because in the olden days, how do you teach kids? You teach them with the rod. And Jesus is like, no, I know more than you. You hit me with that rod, I hit you way harder. So that teacher kind of had it coming because it's like, oh, you're going to talk smack to me? And well, Jesus smacked him right back. And if you could, like, not literally, but lots of nasty stuff there. So the Infancy Gospel of Thomas is actually something also described quite a bit in Litwa's Ias Dias, that basically this was also a common trope that
Yeah.
you should be respecting the gods, and they have like these infancy god stories where anyone who isn't showing proper deference to those deities basically gets to go to hell.
See, I wish he turned the other cheek in that situation, but I'm not sure that he knew what he said in that situation. And then maybe he'd turn the other cheek in hell as well. Like, I'm not
Yeah.
going to do this to these people.
Well, Jesus did turn the other cheek. He kept turning and came right back and slapped you. he was getting a lot of momentum.
He just is like, oh, I'm going to turn all the way around. Bam. Thank you, Mr. Monster. Great question. And of course, it's such a fun thing to find out Jesus was an ass kicker at 3. Jane Mundell, thank you for the super chat. Any literary clues where the author of Matthew is from or lived?
So the way that most commenters will say that Matthew is from Antioch, and the primary indication for that is that people look at Matthew and they look at the letters of Ignatius, the bishop of Antioch, and say, hey, there's a lot of cross-pollination here. Like, it looks like Ignatius knows Matthew, and if they're using the same material, maybe they're in the same community, they're in the same city. I don't find that really all that convincing for a few reasons. One is there's also a lot of uncertainty if Ignatius actually knows the canonical Gospels. A lot of the literature describing this actually says he doesn't know the Gospels, but he just knows their material. And also, it's worth noting that even if someone writes a book in one city, it can travel to other ones. So if it's written in Rome, it can still go to Antioch and affect Ignatius's theology in ways. So I don't think we can really have much of any certainty. Antioch is probably as good a guess as anything else. More likely than not, Matthew probably lived in a more urban place, if for no other reason that's probably where richer people would be able to be and to sell and actually have a church grow. If you're out in the boonies, it's pretty hard to grow a church and have it spread around the world if it takes a few weeks to even send a letter.
There's a scholar, and she's an expert on Matthew. I'm trying to get her on. I've emailed her multiple times. She's a dear friend of Robin Faith Walsh. And she went on to say Matthew's literary composition is so well written, well done in the way that it's formulated that she said, he's on par. She's not saying that Tacitus wrote it. She's saying the level of skill involved was just, it is high up there quality content, the way that they're writing. So don't know if that'll help us even clue in, because the Roman Empire has a lot of different
Yeah,
areas that you can go
right.
through. But
Yeah.
it was interesting to hear her say the level of like how sophisticated the writing was. It's high up. It's
Oh
elite
yeah.
level quality.
Yeah, he is clearly educated. And the fact, like, especially to do this Pesher technique, it's not that you are just barely able to read things. You have to have ingested text so thoroughly to be able to do this that, yeah, you have to be extremely well educated, trained, well read. Yeah, this is not someone from some podunk town who taught himself how to read by looking at the back of cereal boxes. This is someone who is really well instructed, and to get a good teacher like that, more likely than not, you're going to be in the bigger cities. But it's also the case that maybe he went to Rome to get educated, but then he decided that he wanted to retire in Spain. There's just no way of really knowing.
That's well put. Jane, great question. Thank you for the super chat. Duran Chilies, thank you so much. I hope I'm saying that right. Chilies, Chills. Forgive me if I butchered that. Jesus having a God as a father and almost being destroyed as a baby sounds a lot like Augusta and Hercules.
Probably a typo for Augustus, but yeah. This trope is super duper common. Yeah, anyone who's anyone had to have a god for a father, and somebody was trying to kill you as a baby, but either because you were clever, or in the case of Hercules, you were just that damn strong even as a baby that no one's going to take you down.
This is an interesting question too. Yeah. Thank you, or statement, so to speak. Sounds a lot like, and that is the point, right? You and me talked that one night. We opened up Suetonius because she's like, I don't remember a star. But when we went and looked at it, while there wasn't the star motif, everything else kind of checked off, right? It's like, oh, snap, hold on. What the heck, son of God? Oh, my goodness. All the other boxes checked off. So it's like good correction on your part, because I always thought the fire that ascended from the altar, I thought, here's a star right in the sky, but it's really just the flame that was going up. And man, it's just really fun to find this stuff out. You can have fun with this when you aren't like hook, line, and sinker a fundamentalist and talking about this is the truth.
Yeah.
Like, no, this is really fun stuff.
Let me actually give an interesting anecdote for that as well, to show how different these conversations are in other countries. Years ago, I was in Berlin, and I was at the Pergamum Museum, and they had their Egyptian section. And they had on the papyri there, I kind of walked past it because, I don't read Egyptian, but my girlfriend at the time was basically, she knew what my interests were. And it's like saying, hey, you should go back and listen to the audio description of this thing. And it's like, and I go back, and it's like, and there's this infancy story that goes back, and it's placed in the days of the pharaoh Khufu, the person who built the Great Pyramid of Giza. So it's like this, at least the text itself is considered to come from the Old Kingdom. And it basically talks about like prophecies of people being born who are, children of God, who are, life is attempted on them. And it's like, and then the audio thing says, and it's very likely that, stories like this, influence the tales of the story of Jesus. And I'm like, there's no way an American museum would ever say this out loud.
Wow. Yeah, that's an interesting point. And you and me, I still have footage from us in the museum there in Boston that I haven't published. I still have videos we recorded, I haven't edited. Those need to go on Patreon. One mentions Ralph Ellis. I did that one on behalf of our friend Neil. So there's just a lot that you remind me of all of a sudden. We had a blast in that museum, though. That was great.
And when it comes to museums, I do also recommend, if you can somehow get to Berlin, to go to the Pergamon Museum. And in particular, you should take Josh Bowen and or Megan Lewis, because they have that, in the background, they have the dragon from the Ishtar Gate. The Ishtar Gate is in Berlin. It's in that museum.
Wow. We saw like a replica, or at least a piece of, it seemed like that, at least the dragon was up there on the wall.
Oh, yeah.
We saw the dragon. It may not be that specific gate, but we saw that at the museum we were at in Boston.
Yeah, we saw some Assyrian and other related things there. But like I say, like the original Ishtar Gate, or the Germans call it the Ishtar Tour, is literally in the museum in Berlin at the Pergamon Museum. So those of you in MythVision chat, if you happen to be in Germany, that's a place I strongly recommend going.
Thank you. Murteza Mustafa, thank you for the super chat. Any connection Jesus and King Abgar and Queen Helena? Any connection?
The connection is the, how to put this, fever dreams of a modern writer. That's the connections. I know this is ultimately related to the efforts of Ralph Ellis, but let's put it this way. I have engaged with Ellis' stuff before, and he makes more mistakes in one word than I'm allowed to even make in an article. Uh, like literally, he's made like mistakes where when you read
Right.
it in context, you realize by his word choice, he makes not one mistake but doing that, but three mistakes all at once, and that takes effort. Uh, it's ultimately not even fringe, because at least fringe you can follow the line of logic. Here it's just anything that's tangentially related, even across centuries, and you could just change dates willy-nilly. It's not worth more consideration, unfortunately.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. And that video actually that I recorded in 4K, I got to get that on Patreon soon. Or really that one's for Neil, the one that addresses the Ellis stuff. Doc Pluroma in the house again. Thank you, Doc. What about the association in Matthew with the star hymn in one of the letters of Ignatius of Antioch? Is this
Ephesians 19.
yeah.
So among the letters of Ignatius, the first one in the collection you usually see is the one to the Ephesians, and in part 19, verses 2 and 3, is this hymn to this star that's seen in heaven that's amazingly bright. The other stars form a chorus and dance to this new star, and it destroys all magic and the powers of death. It's the basically coming of God's plan coming to fruition. Now, many people look at this and say, hey, star, it talks about magic being destroyed. That sounds like maybe it's the star with the Magi story. But one, the details don't match very well. In fact, two, in context, Ignatius is clear that this star is not at the birth of Jesus. This is Jesus at the resurrection. Because before that, it says that the virginity of Mary, that Jesus' birth and his execution under Pilate were all things that were kept secret. So how was he finally revealed to the aeons, to the ages? Then this star forms. Well, here's the thing: if a star is, singing and dancing, and all the other stars in the sky are singing to this, that is not a mystery kept in silence at his birth. This is clearly something happening as the big announcement at the end, which also comports with other things. So like the hidden descent, but then the extremely revealed ascension back into the heavens. That's something you find like the ascension of Isaiah. I think I also see that in Revelation 12, when it looks maybe like Jesus' birth in heaven in Revelation 12. But again, I'm going to actually argue, and when I was at that presentation at SBL, when I was chatting with people, they agreed with me that this is actually not Jesus' birth, but Jesus' rebirth in heaven and then his ascent from there. But that's another discussion if we want to talk about my SBL presentation.
You already know it, brother. You already know it. Doc, thank you so much for the super chat. Constellation Pegasus in the house. Good to see you here, and thank you, of course, for the support. My job takes me out of state weekly. I stop in a certain part of New Mexico, and the stars are so bright and brilliant. I can see why ancients put so much emphasis on them. They are beautiful when you're in dark places.
That is so absolutely true, and every year I'm able to make a trip out to Albuquerque for another conference that I'm actually a part of and I help put on there. And if you're in New Mexico and you can like rent a car and go, it would say out in the middle of nowhere, but it's actually out to, I think it's still part of Native American reservations or if it's not a national park. But if you go to Chaco Canyon, they have some interesting history there because you have various artifacts from the native peoples that were there. But the most interesting thing was their astronomy there, that they actually had up on top of this gigantic basalt pillar. I'm not exactly sure how the geological formation comes about. I don't know if geology, but it's just like this giant tower or mesa sticking up, and up top there they had this crack in the rock, and behind there they put these like another carved rock, and only on the solstices will the light of the sun go through and go right through the center of that. It was literally like used for their calendar keeping and ceremonies, and showed that they had some reasonably advanced enough astronomy to perform this and do this on this sort of scale. So and when I went there, it was in February, and so there was like maybe only 2 other people around at the time. So you can go there. It's a little bit creepy though to go there, and the only thing you can hear is the wind whipping through the canyon, and you can see the remnants of the people that were there hundreds or thousands of years before.
Wow.
It's a little bit ghostly, but it's also beautiful. So I recommend getting to know that and the peoples that used to be here and the amazing things they did.
Wow, I love it. I really do. And I really appreciate that support. A couple more questions from me. If you have a question, feel free to super chat it before we get done here. And go and subscribe to the Backyard Professor. He's in the house. He said he enjoys you. He says he likes the guests that we have on today.
Thank you.
We'll have to hook you up. And so you can actually go on with him because the Backyard Professor reads a lot as well. And let's see, he's blessed are the cheese makers. I love the life of Brian. Same here. And he says, I like this guest. And trust me, great guy. I'll have to connect you to for sure. All right, question. And this was the last question I had. And it made me think. You were getting so deep into the details, Aaron, on like how to. I should start calling you AA Ron, actually, because it just, my good buddy Aaron over there.
You done messed up, AA Ron.
You done messed up. You went so deep. I said, holy smokes, are scholars dissecting the Greek myths in literature the same way we do biblical scholarship? I think it's because of the motivated reasoning. There's so much religious backing of this topic, and because Christianity is the number one religion in the world in terms of population and stuff, there's so much funding involved. I imagine if we took the scholarship that we do on Pesher and discovering Matthew and its usage of the Hebrew Bible and this and that, and we did this in the Greek world in classics on the grand scale that we are with biblical studies, we might be blown away at what we discover. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would say that actually classicists, and I can't consider myself one of them, but when I was taking Greek and Latin back in college, and so in the classics department, they really showed that like the people that are like extremely focused on Attic literature, the plays that came from Euripides and things like that, there has been a gargantuan amount of that kind of dissection, and see it's like, oh, and here's an allusion to Homer or these other myths, and a lot of that dynamism. It's obviously not going to apply the Pesher technique because it's the wrong kind of text, but there has been this wonderful creative energy that has gone into interpreting and understanding the structures of these sort of things. Just to give another anecdote, when I was in college, and the first like proper philosophy class I had was with my professor, really great woman, Professor Deborah Nails. She's a Plato scholar, and primarily does studying of philosophy in Plato. And she's written a lot of articles, and one of the things she also was trying to do is like, and here's the literary structure of the Republic, and also showing like, and here's how it's structured, and here's like how it has this rising and falling action, and how what happens at the beginning reflects at the end, and those same kinds of details that I was discussing here. That's been part of like some of her work, and all the one of her books that she wrote was. I forget the exact title because it has a really odd word in it, but it was literally a book that went through every single character in all the works of Plato and says who this person is, what their relationship is in history, their familiar relationships, so that way you can get like the complete context of all the human people mentioned in Plato. So if they mention Solon, or if they mention Pythagoras or things like that, you can actually see, and here's who's related to whom and how they relate to Athenian democracy, or the Peloponnesian War, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this kind of energy has gone into the classics, and it has been fruitful. It's just that you don't get to hear about it either in Sunday sermons, and, well, I guess maybe you just need to invite more classicists on Myth Vision so you can hear about it all.
I do. I need to, and I am going to. And in fact, I'm right now in the works. I don't know. This is going to take a miracle to get Mary Beard to join me. I would love to get her on, but I am just, working away, trying to grow this empire here, one stone at a time. So I really appreciate your scholarship. We got a super chat from Hammond again for 420. I don't know if that means it's time to go and smoke for some people. How is it bigger on the inside? I don't understand the question, but do you know?
So he's referring to my space vesicle, the TARDIS. My space vessel, the TARDIS. TARDIS is an acronym for time and relative dimension in space. On the outside, it looks like a early 20th century police box that you would see on the street corners in places like London. But on the inside, it's basically of unlimited space. And how does it do that? Well, the best description of it probably comes from the 10th Doctor, wibbly wobbly timey wimey.
Hey man, thank you for that 420. I really appreciate that. I guess that's a cue for some of you, and I don't blame you. I want to refresh here your YouTube. So I pinned it and asked people to politely go, or else eternal condemnation might fall upon them because we have that kind of power. Subscribe to your YouTube channel, and I pinned it at the top. I hope they've enjoyed what they heard, because if they did, go support people that you like by subscribing and liking their content and sharing it and dropping a comment. For those who don't know, the algorithm gods exist. I know this sounds a little weird, and being an atheist, I'm like kind of a theist in this way. The algorithm gods see your comments, whether they're naughty or nice, and they once a year bring you gifts, things like that. I don't know, some myth like that. It makes sense. I'm going to refresh this in just a moment, reminding you to subscribe. The almost 300 people of you watching, and we're going to see if this number from 451 bumps up to 500. I'd love to see this, and I'm going to give it a few minutes while we do a quick little exit here. You have a website. What's with the website? What is this? Can people support you?
Yeah, well, so through the website is basically just to see who I am, what I'm connected to. You can contact me through there, connect to social medias I have, and I try to update my CV on there. So if I present something, that I try to put something there. Though admittedly, I'm not the fastest at updating things. One of my friends even had to tell me, "Hey, you made 3 typos on the front page," and I was like, "Ah, crap! Problem solved." Yeah, but yeah. The best
hit a
way
1 if you subscribe, by the way. I want to see some ones in the chat if you subscribe to his YouTube channel. Please continue.
Yeah, but when it comes to supporting me, probably the best thing to do is, I have a YouTube channel, but I really don't post much. The best thing you can do is support the people that are willing to listen to me, because that takes time, money, that takes so much stress to listen to my voice for more than 10 minutes. So the places I go, you can support those channels. That's probably the best thing to do to support me. Of course, buying my book, I certainly don't mind. I should also advertise that my editor for this book, Jonathan M.S. Pierce, we're working on a book together that should be coming out soon on aliens and religion. I have direct experience hunting for aliens. I used to be an intern at the SETI Institute, and I got to use their telescopes to scan the skies and potentially pick up signals from beyond. So we're turning that into do aliens exist? And if they do, does that screw up all of religion? But that book isn't on Amazon yet. We're still getting people to proof it, tell us what's good, what's great, and getting endorsements and all that. That is to come, and I'm sure Jonathan and I will both want to come on and tell you our good news.
Yeah, let's hear the good news, the evangelion, if you will, of Aaron Adair, or Aaron, and our good friend Jonathan. So we also have the Patreon. Come check us out. I say this and I mean this. You can join if you don't have a lot for $3 a month. It's less than Starbucks coffee. Like it's literally half the cost. It might be like a gas station coffee. And you're in the door and you'll see all the content. I am going to be doing more things for people who are on higher tiers as this year unfolds, 2023. But you can enter and become a partner of what we do for $3 a month. Literally, you can cancel anytime too. But you can come and go. If this month I don't have $3, next month I do. Help us out. I really, really could use it to do what I'm trying to accomplish. And I'm also doing a college website my wife is creating as we speak. She's been doing this. Been doing it for weeks now, but she's literally working on it as we speak. The college courses, making it affordable, bringing the education to you from academics. And there's a lot of videos that are on here that aren't on YouTube that you'll get access to. And I plan on doing more, of course, as we unfold. Yeah. The other virgin births in antiquity too. But go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm also a patron of yours as well. So I've seen that content that's behind the paywall. And I can also say I'm glad I'm a patron. I do like the access, and it's worth the money.
Well, thank you. I'll send you the check later for saying that. No, for real. I really appreciate that. And of course, it keeps me going. And I also have something for those who are like, well, what else do you offer? Well, I'll tell you what else I'm offering. I have Dr. Dennis R. McDonald coming in January to stay at my house. In fact, I'm going to do something I don't usually do here. I'm going to do something unique. And we'll get to your super chat here in a second. This is the downstairs to the house. That room right there is where my brother's currently staying, but he's relocating. And Dr. Dennis R. McDonald's going to be coming, staying here. And I'm not only going to be recording a mimesis course on Greek literature and its relationship to the Gospels, a academic college level course. You know, he went to Harvard. He was also in California teaching for many years, retired Claremont. He's going to be educating at an affordable cost, taking that course where you can go and subscribe, like buy the course, watch it 4K, edited amazing. But I'm taking questions from Patreon members, and I'm going to put that post up sometime soon so that I can ask him. I'd like one question per person. It's a lot of work to edit all this. In 4K, I'm going to interview Dr. Dennis R. McDonald asking your question. Is that not enough to make you want to support what we're doing? I want to do that, and I want to make that something that we do here at Myth Vision that you don't find anywhere else. I'm also having Dr. Kip Davis come the last week of January to do Old Testament course, and we're going to take your questions if you're a Patreon member of Myth Vision. Join. Help us out. You can do it for as little as $3 a month. Imagine getting a 4K video at $3 a month. And I'm just making the point that, like, help us out. Let's keep educating. Let's keep making a change and making people fall in love with this literature for what it is. It's literature. We take the power back from the fundamentalists out there that want to monopolize this text and empower people, right, with understanding. So help us out. Okay, we got a super chat. This gives us more time for people to subscribe to your YouTube channel, Dr. Adair. I love that when people bring mercy to making it to the next number. What are you at? 500 right now? Or you're at 4?
You said 451 before.
Okay, you're at 451. We're going to get you to 500, fingers crossed. Everyone in the chat, blow my mind and go way beyond that. But let's see how many subscribers to your YouTube channel we can get, Dr. Adair, because I believe in doing this. Minder Bender, thank you. Happy holidays, folks. Thank you so much. I appreciate that super chat and for distracting us just a tad bit longer to let those that are last minute before the second coming of Myth Vision happens, they can enter into the kingdom. They have this opportunity.
I do also want to give them one last chance. So I should also mention as well that after this stream in a couple hours, I'm going to be on Godless Engineer for another live stream with Richard Carrier. So I'm going to be
today.
A lot today.
Okay. What time is that?
2 hours from now, basically.
Okay, so go check that out as well, and go and show them some love and support. And
and so if for some reason your finger just can't reach all the way to the subscribe button before the stream is over, you'll have another chance later tonight.
Someone says I triggered somebody. Ray says, Derek, you appeared to have triggered somebody. I don't know who. I'm curious.
I'm not following the chat, so I don't know what drama's happening.
I don't either. Maybe it's this person. I don't know. Yeah, there is a portal to Hades in literally in it's Caesarea Philippi. Yeah, Caesarea Philippi. There's right there at the Temple of Pan. There's a portal down into Hades in the underworld.
I've also found that actually King Hades lived in Western Greece in one of the euhemerized versions of the story of which hero was it now? Not Romulus. I'm trying to remember. Theseus. Theseus goes and he has to visit Hades, but Hades is actually a king. He lives in Western Greece, and Cerberus, his dog, is actually just a couple of dogs that all just live together rather than an actual three-headed dog. It was one of those rationalizations that came up in the 1st, 2nd century AD. So if you're really looking for Hades, Western Greece.
Interesting. Worth going and finding hell or Hades or wherever you want to go with it, because there's some people who want to say that hell itself or Hades is going to be thrown in the lake of fire. Someone said, you ever thought about creating a nonprofit? Good examples are Mormon discussions and Mormon stories. Just a thought given educational content. I don't even know where to begin on that, but I'm not closed off to the idea for sure. A day without triggering someone is a day lost. This is Doc knows my philosophy. It makes me sleep better at night. So I really appreciate that. And Anthony says Derek will repent on his deathbed. This is sad that it takes me to the point of that, that I'd have to.
Well, I'm going to probably feel the same way because I'll be laying on my deathbed and I'll be thinking, I should have eaten more pancakes.
I might actually be like, I'm sorry, Zeus. I should have listened to you this whole time, but I didn't. Anyway, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Vesper, thank you for this. John McHugh was on Gnostic Forum the other day showing the entire birth narrative in the constellations with Jesus as the star Regulus. Thoughts? Have you watched that?
Yeah, I did watch that stream, and I think he's also given the same presentation before. I think both on Gnostic Forum and your channel, because I know he's been on both.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm familiar with this case, and when I was reading through that section of his book, because I got to read everything related to my subject matter, I have conflicting thoughts. So I do want to tell you this, that when he's talking about like the way of using cuneiform signs and like going back and forth between Akkadian and Sumerian, using related words or similar sounding words, things like that, to do these sorts of things. From what I have read, this actually was done by the Assyrian Babylonian scholars, that was actually a norm way of interpreting things. So what he's doing there is not like something he just made up. It's actually something in the Assyriology literature. The question is, does it apply to what's going on with Matthew's story? And I am not very convinced of that for a couple of reasons. One is it's unclear to me that he could even know the language or the script, if for no other reason. That script was dying and was basically dead by the end of the 1st century AD. Like the last cuneiform tablet we have found, I think, is from the 70s AD, and that was in Mesopotamia. And we haven't found this in 1st century Galilee or something like that. So the idea that this was a tradition that was alive and well at that time seems to go against that archaeological evidence. So that seems to be a methodological problem there. Like, how can we even show this the case? And not to mention, when Matthew does cite a source of how he knows what's happened at Jesus' birth, he never cites.
Did he get raptured? Did we just witness a miracle? Oh my gosh. Hit a 1 if we witnessed a miracle. And if you're skeptical of that miracle right now, show me by hitting a 2. I got to know, did we just witness a miracle right now in front of our eyes? Oh my gosh. I'm putting a 1. Somebody put a 1. Here we go. Let's see what you have to say. And abracadabra. Oh my gosh, dude. I have. Are you okay? Bro, what just happened, bro?
Okay, so.
Oh my.
This shouldn't happen, but the TARDIS was struck by lightning and it activated the time circuit. So I'm in another galaxy at the moment. It took me a while to reconnect to the Wi-Fi here. By the way, there is galactic Wi-Fi. I'll tell you the password later.
How far into the future did you just go?
Well, when you call it the future, it's a little bit hard to say, because when I was calling you from what you would call 4087 AD. So I was already kind of in your future. What year is it right now?
This is so real. Everybody, this is real. Hit a like if you believe that this is real. Or hit the like button or hit a 1 something. Okay, tell me more, Aaron. What is going on?
All right. So I guess what happened is just that, all right, I have to come clean. I'm not human. Tell me the truth. I'm actually a Time Lord from the planet Gallifrey.
I freaking
And so is John McHugh. And we're actually enemies. So I think he just attacked the TARDIS and he was trying to kick me out from here.
I'm not laughing because this is funny. I'm laughing because this is so real. Wow. Bro, you should write a gospel. You should write bro, people will believe this is real. They got witness right here. We have 277 witnesses, not quite 500 that saw it.
Well, I now have to make the connection complete. So, this is the Doctor Who set. The 12th Doctor is played by the actor Peter Capaldi, who also played one of the wise men in the BBC Nativity story from 2010. So, he is literally a wise man, as well as a Time Lord who can travel anywhere in time and space. The connection is complete.
Man, everything you've been telling you... This is like the Gospel of Mark. You've been hiding your true identity this entire time, and you've been dropping little hints, but all of us dim-witted disciples didn't notice.
Shh, tell no one.
Okay, go and tell no one, everybody. Don't tell anyone.
Subscribe.
Make sure that you let the algorithm gods know about this channel. Hallelujah.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, you were saying just about your enemy, Dr. Yeah. So please.
Yeah. So like I say, the first methodological point of it's unlikely that this knowledge was still existent, let alone being practiced in the first century by the early Christians, just because cuneiform knowledge was all but dead by that time. And it was dying and dying and dying before then. So it seems unlikely there. And secondly, the method of actually then connecting the story to the particular things in the sky, because of all the different choices you can make, where you can choose any star you want, any constellation you want, you can choose between different languages, you can choose between related words, or even words that just sound similar. The amount of flexibility that it creates basically is, if you've ever watched a psychic like John Edwards, like I'm hearing an M name. Is someone named Martha, Mary, Margaret? Does anyone have a father, brother, nephew, cousin, former roommate with an M name? It's like, eventually you're going to get a hit just because you're becoming so broad. You're allowing that level of flexibility. I'm not accusing the Hugh of being fraudster in that way. It's just that methodology doesn't allow itself to be constrained to show that this is what's going on. It can fit too many possibilities.
Okay.
And the fact that he can use the same stars to show and to create both the Matthean and the Lucan narrative story using the same thing, if it can produce opposites, it's probably too flexible a method to figure out that's what they actually did do. Now, we can confirm this was done by Babylonians, in part because in some places they do spell it out for us. So we know this thing can happen, but to show in a particular case, I don't think we're able to do that unless Matthew comes out and says, let the stars behold this. If you want
pretty
a better
much
place,
the methodology you're saying isn't rigorous enough on this particular. It's not a good enough methodology to use on this.
Yeah, and I wouldn't even say it's because it's a fault on McHugh's part. It's a fault on the very strategy that McHugh's is citing that existed. It's that basically those scholars from antiquity were basically doing the John Edwards sort of thing, and they could make any connection they wanted to, given enough, degrees of separation.
Now, I do want to mention one thing now that you're done with this, is after witnessing the miracle you did earlier, if Aaron died, let's just say, the fact that you wouldn't believe he's going to rise from the dead and you be in fear and run is just ridiculous. So let's learn from the mistakes of the disciples in the Gospels and not act like we would be shocked that he would rise from the dead. We witnessed a miracle earlier, right? The Gospels paint all these miracles Jesus did, and then they all of a sudden are like, oh, he's dead, and that's it. Really? You witnessed all of this that just happened here on Myth Vision, and you don't think Aaron Adair's coming back? Come on now. I'm going ahead and trying to give people Easter eggs. You see what I mean?
I should point out, though, that I don't die and rise from the dead. I regenerate into a new body.
Okay. Huh.
Which is actually, it's again a connection to Doctor Who, because the show has been going on since 1963, and you can't have the same actor for that period of time.
Right.
So they created the narrative idea that eventually the Doctor gets too old and he dies, and then he just regenerates and becomes a new character, a new person, so that way they can bring a new actor in. And that they've been doing that literally since 1966.
See, we know that is the lie. We know it's the same guy for real. It's not a different actor. It's the same guy.
All Santa Clauses are real.
Right. They're all real, and they're just omnipresent in different locations, like Jesus is the star and the baby at the same time. Yeah. Okay. We need to, is it not time to go ahead and let's see if the miracle also applies to the subscribers?
Let us see. Behold.
All right, everybody. Let's see what happens now. I'm going to do a countdown, a 10-second countdown. The YouTube channel is in the chat. Get into the kingdom before it's too late. Ready? 10, 9. You can count it with me if you want.
Oh.
8, 7, 6,
6,
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Here we go. Oh, man. We only gained, 9 people?
No, 11.
11. Dude, there's so many people.
That's 2 ones. They gave us the 2 ones I asked for.
Well, I just don't want to see everybody going to that naughty place. But for those who are in the kingdom, you're good. Don't worry. We love you. Don't worry. We love you. Seriously, Dr. Adair, this has been a blast. I don't know what happened to your internet earlier, but the miracle was there. So anyone who doubts it, just they need help. Are there any conclusions in the totality that you would like to say for our audience before we let you go?
When we are looking at stories, look for the human behind it, because the creativity of people is the only divinity that I think we can show exists.
That's an interesting point. I'm with you. I'm with you. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope to have you back. Let's do the alien thing. How soon is that going to be ready? That's going to be published? Do you know?
Yeah, so the last time I was chatting with John about this, and we talked about it actually on Jacob Berman's History Valley channel, he announced it to me right then and there that we were talking February. I joked that we have the manuscript now, so I could send it to you now, but there are, things to be done before it's deliverable. So we're talking February.
Okay. Well, let's aim for February. Go subscribe, check them out, help support us, like this video, drop a comment, show us some love, and thank you for everybody in whatever ways you can help. I really appreciate that. Never forget, we are Myth Vision.
Myth Vision.